So yesterday I did a video about what I know about Ukraine for sure. Today I want to talk about what I know about Russia for sure. And I talked about Russia a little bit in that video yesterday, but I want to talk about what I know about Russia for sure. I'm positive about these points. I am certain about these points. So the first is, when will the people of Russia rise up? The answer is that they won't. They're not calculated to. There's nothing in their culture, there's nothing in their experience that causes them to rise up. Not, I mean, they might artificially be ginned up by political leaders to do something that the political leaders want to do, but to overthrow Putin, I wouldn't count on it. So there was a comment in one of my videos a long time ago. I think his name was Ozzy, who said, Ukrainians are Cossacks and Russians are peasants. And I think he hit it on the head. That's right. The mentality in Russia has just been this beat down something. Now, what's interesting about that is that the Ukrainians had the Maidan Revolution, and the Russians didn't have anything like that. And that's because while they share a similar experience throughout the Soviet system with the Soviet Union, we got to 1991 and the breakup, and the Ukrainians started walking west, and the Russians kept kind of doing what the Russians were doing before. In fact, they've authoritarianized, if I can use that term, over time. And so it's just a different experience. The Ukrainians had the Maidan, and the Russians have had more authoritarianism. So that brings me to point two. Russia is not democratic. It has the veneer of a democratic state, but in a meaningful way. Does anybody really believe that Putin won't be elected next year? I don't mean because he doesn't have a great competitor, but because a competitor would fall out of a hotel balcony or is in jail, like Navalny or Gherkin, or whoever might think about challenging him, is not in any position to do it because it's an authoritarian state masquerading as a democracy. That brings me to point three. Russia is re-Sovietizing, and they're re-Sovietizing in a big way. There are, and when I say that, I don't mean that they're trying to become Marxist Leninists who are striving for the equality of the proletariat. It's not that at all. It is using the worst elements, the authoritarian mechanisms that were trying to make those work in the Soviet Union. That's what they're trying to import for the sake of the regime in power. And I say it is a regime in power. They talk about the Zelensky regime, because they're trying to, this is just as bad. They're an authoritarian state. They're re-Sovietizing. They're losing their freedom headlong. As the war continues, they're losing more and more freedom in Russia, and it's very sad to see. Point number four, Russia invaded Ukraine on multiple pretexts. So I was watching videos last night, just out of curiosity, looking at videos before the invasion, and in the United States, they were pre-bunking. What they were doing was they're taking the intelligence that they knew and saying ahead of time, ahead of what incident might have happened, that this is what we think the Russians are going to do. They're going to create a false incident between Ukraine and Russia, and then that's going to be their pretext to invade. Well, because they did that, the Russians didn't actually use a false incident. Now, we never know. They might not have ever gone to do that, but that's what Hitler did in the 30s with Poland. They crossed the border, created a pretext that the Poles were oppressing the German speakers, and then they set up this fabricated thing about how the Poles were attacking and they killed these Poles and whatever. Okay, so that's what was probably going to happen. So they were going to use that, but it was pre-bunked. So then the argument was then Russian speakers need to be defended within Ukraine, and so that's a reason to invade. And then with that, now I find that fascinating that they would say that, but then they ignore the 1.3 million Russian speakers in Israel, who they don't seem to care about very much. This was also a point that I got from one of my viewers who put that into comments. Now, then they also came along with the idea that there are Nazis. There are Nazis in Ukraine. The Nazis! We need to denazify Ukraine. Where are the Nazis? In World War II, if you ask Germans, like, are you Nazis? They would say Heil, right? But you don't see that in Ukraine. Is it just that they're hidden Nazis and they're trying to pretend that they're not, but they can't help but wearing Nazi items on their clothing because that's who they really are? Is that really what you think is going on? They're not Nazis. Now, they use the term Nazi loosely to mean anyone who's opposed to Russia, but they also mean it. They chose that word deliberately to muddy the waters because they know that Nazi is bad and the world thinks Nazis are bad. So if they call their opponents Nazis, then they have some kind of high ground. And then the fourth excuse was that NATO was encroaching, but NATO wasn't really encroaching. And I'm going to talk about that as a whole different subpoint in just a little bit. Number 5, Russia lies. And they even have a culturally accepted form of lying and deceiving called Veranyo, which is like, I know you're lying, you know I'm lying, I know you know I'm lying, right? I mean, it goes on with that. But that's the way that it works. Now, if you couple that lying in the culture with authoritarianism, the state can lie to you, and we all know that the state's lying to us, and that's how we function. If we couple that with democracy, we know it's not a true democracy. We know that it's a veneer of democracy. If you couple that with the media, you know that you can't trust what the media says. You know that they're lying to you on TV and on the internet, but you still just put up with it anyway. And then you take that and you extend that and you look at it from the point of view of what they say about Ukraine, and you'd be incredulous if you were to try to believe these things. So we had Zelensky fakes, like, Zelensky, what looked like Zelensky saying that you need to surrender early on. You had body bags moving behind reporters, and that turned out to be a fake. I'm going to do a whole video about this next. Body bags be moving behind a reporter, and see, it's fakes. Well, it wasn't from that. It wasn't about Ukraine. It was something totally different that they just dubbed in English language, or not English. Well, maybe it wasn't English. They dubbed in language talking about Ukraine. Then you had Bucha, Ukraine planted actors. No, what happened in Bucha was atrocities. These ideas that they planted actors and that hands were moving or whatever. No, that didn't happen. Zelensky's shopping spree in Paris, totally made up. Zelensky's shopping spree in New York with Cartier jewelry. Happened. The receipt was when she was in Canada. Come on, really? Try harder. Zelensky bought 2 yachts through surrogates just last week. That was part of the media conspiracy. It didn't happen. Okay, anyone who believes these lies at this point deserves to be deceived because they're wanting to be deceived. And so that's what they're going to get. Point number 6, Russia is going to keep going. So this is the misery. They're kind of like the Borg from Star Trek, if you understand what that reference is. The budget of Russia on military spending is about 30%, and total defense spending, or military and security total, is about 40% of their budget. Think about that. Think about how much of that budget it is. They just increased to the point that there's going to be 170,000 new soldiers added next year. Now, you got to compensate for the 121 taken off the battlefield by Ukraine in the last 6 months, according to Ukrainian figures. Couple all that with that 28% of the budget is in oil and gas. And that's going to be important because when I talked about the size of Russia, how big it is, how vulnerable it is because of its size, 28% oil and gas. Without oil and gas revenue, Russia would crumble. Okay, Russia also has no will to stop, and Putin wants to return these Russian lands. I see zero indications anywhere that Putin's like, you know what, this was a bad idea, let's stop this. They talk about negotiation, but they are not actually wanting to stop. They want to give their opponents a black eye and say, see, they're not even willing to negotiate, but they're not wanting to stop. And if they do stop, it's only to catch a breath so that they can come back again. Now, again, they're keeping going, and they're keeping going for a reason. For Putin's ambition, because Putin wants to return these Russian lands. He wants to be Peter the Great reincarnated. Now, think about this. For his ambition, 1,070 Russian soldiers were taken off the battlefield yesterday. Probably a huge majority of them, or a huge number of them, were killed. Let's say 1,000 Russian families are now devastated for Putin's ambition. 330,000 Russian families have been some way affected by killed or casualties since this war began. 330,000. for Putin's ambition. But he has no plans to stop because it's an authoritarian system, not a democracy. Russia Russians' culture, this is point number 7. Their culture is very warlike, and it always has been. There's no, like, when you think about who the threat is in that neighborhood, you might think China. Okay, China has some military ambitions, especially to take Taiwan and to be a regional power in the area, and they're not happy with us because we're kind of a check to that. But other than that, who else is it? It's Russia. We don't worry about the Kazakhstanis. We don't think, oh, those warlike Finns. They were freaking Vikings, and we're not worried about them. But the Russians, they keep doing that. Now, this is that point I was talking about with NATO. NATO keeps moving east. No, it's not that NATO moves east. They're running away from you. So think about this. Every single Warsaw Pact nation, the Baltics, which were part of Russia, or the Soviet Union proper, they were gobbled up by the Soviet Union and consumed into the Soviet Union. Even proudly neutral Finland joined NATO because of Russia. Because Russia is that much of a threat that all the Warsaw Pact nations join the other side because Russia's a threat. They regularly talk about things like, let's nuke the West. We're going to have to nuke them. We're going to show them what this is like. A little nuclear bomb isn't going to, right? Watch Russian state media and you'll see that. So they have this warlike culture. Japan and Germany also had this warlike culture as well. And after World War II, after defeat, that was kind of pushed out of their culture. Because of defeat, because of the way they had to be restructured afterwards, the high road to success in the German military, as I understand it, is through administration, not through, like warlike means. Same thing with Japan. Japan had a Bushido culture for a long time, the way of the warrior, and Japan is not the militant thing that it once was. So the best thing for Russia would be to be defeated and have this cultural component extracted from their culture. Now, if they're defeated, this ensures Ukrainian reparations so that the country can be rebuilt. It ensures the future security of Europe, at least from the threat of Russia in the near and midterm. And you'll also, and this is the most important piece, get Ukrainian children back. And that's what's more important than just about anything else here. We'll talk more about why they're doing that in just a moment. Okay, point number 8. Russian culture is weirdly racist. I mean, like weirdly racist. So you wouldn't know this from the outside looking in until you pay attention, but Russia is a conglomerate of different ethnicities, but we think of Russian as these like really pasty white guys, like kind of looking like me, like very white. But there's a lot of ethnic minorities within Russia. But the minorities are disproportionately killed in the war in Ukraine. They're disproportionately sent to the front. Couple that with, they talk about how Ukrainians are really our brothers. They're really Russians that just don't get it. They politically are thinking this, but they're really ethnically Russian. They're us. Now, there isn't a lot of genetic difference between Ukrainians and Russians, but they grew up as different people, as different as Americans and Canadians are different. We're not the same peoples. Politically, they're worlds apart, and Russians can't stand this. They really, I'm not sure which is more of a threat to the Russians, that Ukraine is joining NATO or is on the path to join NATO, or that they're trying to join the EU and trying to be that separate from them. Remember, they left, like think about the Maidan Revolution. The Maidan Revolution, the president at the time was going to sign an agreement that would bring them closer to Europe, but he didn't want to violate his bonds with Russia. But it was more than that. He wanted to keep a political prisoner in jail, and the Europeans wanted this prisoner to be released as part of joining, coming closer into Europe's orbit. And Russia really didn't want that, so they were giving him a sweetheart deal. He signed this pact, the people rose up, and then he was firing on his own people, and Russia's over there nodding in approval, saying, yeah, this is a good thing, what he's doing. But they were only upset when he fled the country, and then they called it a coup. And then the Russians, as Russians do, talked about the coup that they made up rather than talking about how they actually fomented rebellion in the eastern oblasts and sending in their little green men and then took over Crimea by force and had a fake election. And okay, you get the idea. Okay. So let's get back to where we were. So Russian culture, number 8, was weirdly racist. Ukrainians are brothers, but they're not really like thinking the right way, and so they must be either re-educated or destroyed. Politically, they're worlds apart, and Russians can't stand this. Anyone who doesn't acknowledge the beauty, the wonder, the value of the Russian mirror, that's the Russian world, and how important the Russian world is seen as a Nazi. Okay, number 9, Russian culture is bipolar. And I don't mean that in the biological sense. I mean it in the sense that on one hand, they're very proud. We're the best. The Ruski Mir. This is the best thing. What good is Russia without, or what good is the world without Russia? And at the same time, they see themselves as embattled. They're this great expansive empire, the former Soviet Union, and they want to restore that. But the U.S. wants to steal our resources, and they talk like this in some of their videos or in their news articles. I mean, it's really weird to see the disparity between those two things. Number 10, and I talked about this yesterday, I think, Russia's strength is its size, but its weakness is also its size. So the Ukrainians just hit them in a railroad tunnel between Russia and China. And the weird thing about this is they hit them 1,000 miles away from the Ukrainian border. And if they can hit them there, they can hit them in all kinds of places. And there's no real way for Russia to defend all those places while they still have 100,000, a few 100,000 in Ukraine. Probably more like 300,000 soldiers in and around and supporting in Ukraine. And something north of that. Okay, so Russia's strength is its size, but its weakness is its size. They spend 40% of their budget, 40%, I talked about this a little bit ago, 40% on security, military and other security. In contrast, the United States spends about 12% of its budget on defense. Britain spends 2.3% of its budget on defense. The Russians can't keep jacking that up forever, whereas other countries can, and if they only had the will, they should, and they could. Okay, Russia's facing a demographic crisis. This is point number 11. They know it, we know it, they know we know it. Okay, here's the thing. About 30 years ago, the shape of the demographic cone went like that. it just dropped significantly, and they haven't been able to repopulate yet. Okay, they can replenish it by migration, but who's migrating to Russia? And we don't really want people that don't look like us, that aren't really Russians. Okay, they can replenish it by taking over other populations, but then you still have that weird shape, probably, if it's other former Soviet populations. Or they can replenish it by stealing Ukrainian children. Ding, ding, ding. That's one of the ways that they're replenishing it. Now, Putin just last week urged women to have up to 8 babies. Like, that's how aware they are that they have a demographic crisis. Okay, that was point 11. Point 12, this is the last one. Russia pines for the good old days of the Soviet Union. They really do. All this talk about a multipolar world is because instead of America being the global hegemon, America's not the global hegemon. America's actually keeping all these bad actors from acting out by saying, this is probably not a good idea. If you want to do that, we're going to have problems. But they're not like global hegemoning in the sense that Russia would be a global hegemon if they had the power to do it. The multipolar world is this idea that, we want to have this balance between the United States-led West and let's say the former Soviet Union on the other side. Or at least, if not that, you want to have China and then Russia and then other countries right. That's what they want because they pine for the good old days. Now, the BRICS are not going to replace the trade that Russia lost with the West. They're trying. Africa won't do it. They're too poor. The ruble will not replace the dollar. The dollar is the currency in which things are traded because we don't trust the ruble. We don't trust other currencies. And as silly as we've been in what we've done with the dollar in the United States, most countries have done worse. I mean, so there's a reason for using the dollar. Moreover, and I said earlier that I would talk about this again. 90 of 110 statues of Stalin have gone up since Putin in Russia have gone up since Putin has been in power. They're remaking his image and they're rebranding him as some great guy where he killed millions of his own people. Like they're ignoring his atrocities. And the older you are, the more you pine for the old Soviet days. So there's something about that in the Russian culture. They are really kind of trying to rebrand the old former Soviet Union or pine for the old Soviet Union, and they might get it. Now, they're not going to get what they hoped for. They're not going to get this expansive empire, but they might get the authoritarianness that came with it. And that's what I know about Russia. Okay, tell me what you think about this. What did I miss? Was this helpful? Tell me how you processed it. I would like to hear that in the comments below. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes. By the way, this is my 1,000th video. 1,000. I never thought that I would be to 1,000 videos when I started doing this, but here we are, and I'm going to keep going as long as I need to. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.